Hi, boys and girls. We're going to do a quick review, and then we're going to move on. We know that the anger really started at the end of the French and Indian War when England won. And in 1763, that's when King and Parliament threw tap onto the colonists. The T is taxes to pay for that war. A, the governor, the babysitter in each colony gets more power, more control, more authority. And P, the proclamation of 1763, which is all about the land, the Ohio River Valley, that now the colonists cannot use because of that law. As if that's not bad enough, in 1764, Parliament adds the Sugar Act, which is a tax on all imports. Great. And then we know that a lot of the colonists were feeling as if their voices were not heard, as if they had no representation, like James Otis and his sister Mercy Otis Warren. As if all of that is not bad enough, the very next year in 1765, Parliament adds a new tax, a new law called the Stamp Act, which is a tax on anything made out of paper. Awesome job. We know that a lot of colonists were feeling angry. Some colonists were feeling loyal to the king. Some didn't know how they felt. But we know that the colonists that were angry couldn't express their anger freely for fear of committing a very serious crime called treason. But it was the Stamp Act when a lot of colonists just couldn't contain their anger and frustration anymore. It was after the Stamp Act was implemented that many started to express their anger and they started to protest. What I would like you to do is take a second and brainstorm with your partner some ways the colonists protested the king's and parliament's unfair rules and laws. We're going to pause the video for a minute, let you brainstorm, and then we'll come back together and see what you came up with. All right, so hopefully you were to remember the 6 things that we talked about. Of course, there were more ways the colonists protested, but we did talk about 6 in particular, some violent, some non-violent. Here they are, some very simple things that the colonists did. They wrote letters to the king and parliament expressing their frustration and their anger. Some even wrote petitions, which are letters that are signed by many people showing a big support for the ideas in that letter, with the goal of trying to get parliament to remove taxes. We know that, unfortunately, some colonists, especially in the city of Boston, did result to violence against tax collectors, against loyalists, against governors. And sure, violence happened all throughout the colonies, but especially in the city of Boston in Massachusetts. We did talk about the fact that many colonists boycotted. They refused to buy those things that are being taxed by the king and parliament. They refused to buy imports. They refused to buy paper. And therefore, the king wouldn't get the tax money that he was hoping for and hopefully make a change. We did talk about that it's a lot easier to ignore a piece of paper like a letter or a petition. It's a lot harder to ignore someone face to face. So, excuse me. The colonists sent Ben Franklin, very well respected by the colonists, very well respected by Parliament, to go talk to Parliament in person in England. We talked about some of the things that made Ben Franklin famous. He discovered lightning as electricity, and that led him to inventing something that saved thousands and thousands of lives, the lightning rod. He invented the wood stove, which was originally called the Franklin stove. He invented bifocal glasses. He came up with the idea for public libraries and volunteer fire departments. He was an inventor. He was a writer. He had his own newspaper. And he lived in our very own state of Pennsylvania. He was from the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. So they sent him to go talk to England, send him to England to talk to Parliament about the unfair rules and laws. And then last but not least, we talked about the colonists forming secret groups. We know they had to meet in secret because they were at risk of committing treason. And we know that one of these secret groups was from Boston, and it was the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty wasn't just made up of any people. It was some of the richest and most important people of Boston. People like the richest man of Boston, John Hancock. People like Sam Adams. People like Paul Revere, Silversmith. They made up this secret group to talk about things that they could do to protest the unfair rules and laws. I know that it surprised us all, but when colonists threw this temper tantrum, when they protested, Parliament shocked us all. They repealed or removed the Stamp Act. I know that surprised me based on some of the things Parliament's been doing, but Parliament responded to the colonist protests and repealed the Stamp Act. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, colonists celebrated. I think they were as surprised as we were. People like John Hancock, member of the Sons of Liberty, richest man in Boston, spent his own money to set off fireworks throughout the city of Boston. In New York City, one of the major cities in the colonies, they actually put up a 4,000-pound metal statue of KG3 to celebrate KG3 and say thank you. Now, I want you to remember this statue of KG3 because we will see that statue again later on in our story. Unfortunately, almost as soon as Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they realized they had made a terrible mistake, that they had given in to the colonist tantrums, which is sending the wrong message. It's sending the message that the colonists are in charge, not Parliament. So Parliament quickly replaced the Stamp Act with the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Act basically took care of Parliament's problem. The problem was rowdy colonists in cities like Boston. So the Townshend Act put British soldiers into the streets of these rowdy cities. They put British soldiers into the streets of Boston and hoped to get these angry protesting colonists under control. Now, they told the colonists that those soldiers were there to protect the Ohio River Valley. If that were the case, we would assume those soldiers would be put in the Ohio River Valley, not in cities like Boston, where the colonists have very clearly expressed their anger. So at this point, we have some terrible news. We have soldiers with guns. We talked about yesterday, these soldiers, the average age was 19 years old for one of these British soldiers. These were kids themselves being sent 3,000 miles away from their home and put in streets where they are not welcome by these angry colonists. And things went from bad to worse. In 1770, the magic number's 5. At this point, we are 5 years from the start of the Revolutionary War. Because of this Townshend Act, because we had soldiers in the same cities as angry colonists, this led to a massacre. This led to the first deaths to be seen in all of the events leading up to the Revolutionary War. We run into the first set of deaths in Boston. It is called the Boston Massacre. At this point, you're going to hear the story of the Boston Massacre and compare it to a picture that was created to share what happened to the rest of the colonists throughout the 13 colonies about that day, March 5th, 1770, when the first people were killed in this quest for independence. So news reached KG3 back in England about all the violence that has been occurring in Boston and about the Boston Massacre. Did he do something to make things better? Well, I'm sure you could take a guess. He actually made things worse. In 1773, the king made a law in the colonies that allowed British companies to sell tea in the colonies for a very, very low price. This took business away from the colonists who were selling tea. And the colonists still had to pay a tax on this tea. So they are taxing the colonists for the tea they're buying, and they're basically forcing the colonists to buy tea from British sellers instead of other colonists. So colonists who made their living off of selling tea in the colonies began to lose their businesses. And this law was called the Tea Act. And one group in particular had a big problem with this new law. And that group was the Sons of Liberty in Boston. In 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty dressed up like Mohawk Indians. Now, I will tell you right now, they did not mistake a single person. They did not look anything like Mohawk Indians, but their goal was to disguise themselves enough that they could not get in trouble for what they were about to do. What they did was they boarded 3 British ships that were carrying tea into Boston to be sold, taking the jobs away from the colonists of Boston. And they boarded the ships. And these Sons of Liberty like Sam Adams, who led the charge, John Hancock, Paul Revere, they boarded these British ships and threw that tea off into the harbor, basically sending the message to the king and parliament, we don't want your stinking tea. I will tell you that the names of the 3 ships were the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and the Eleanor, and in total, they threw 340 chests of tea weighing over 92,000 pounds into the Boston harbor. In total, that tea today would have been worth over $1.5 million in today's money. And this event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, it was absolutely not a party, but that is what this has become known as throughout history. The Sons of Liberty throwing that tea into the Boston Harbor, sending that message to the King and Parliament, "We don't want your stinking tea," became known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, if you have time, you are going to watch the very first episode of Liberty's Kids. Liberty's Kids is extremely historically accurate, but there are some fictional characters we need to meet. Someone who is real and really existed is this guy right here. That is Ben Franklin. He's our writer. He owns a newspaper, a printing press in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When the movie starts, though, he is not in Philadelphia. He is actually in England on his way to talk to Parliament about the unfair rules and laws. This guy right here, his name is James. James is a apprentice of Ben Franklin. He lives with Ben Franklin and works for him as an apprentice because he wants to be a journalist one day. He wants to be a writer one day. And so he's trying to learn from the best. He's trying to learn from Ben Franklin. And we'll learn more about James and his very, very strong opinions. This little boy right here, this is Henri. Henri is a little boy from France. He is also living with Ben Franklin in his print shop in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We'll learn more about how he came to live with Ben Franklin, but you will find out pretty quickly that Henri loves to eat. He loves food. I'm going to skip over to this guy. This is Moses. Moses works for Benjamin Franklin in his print shop. He is a free slave, and we'll learn more about how he became free because he was once a slave, and he lives and works with Benjamin Franklin in his print shop in Philadelphia. This girl right here, her name is Sarah Phillips, no relation to me, Mrs. Phillips. She is actually from England, where her mom lives, and that is her mom is actually who Ben Franklin will be staying with when he is in England. And Sarah Phillips, when the show begins, she's actually leaving England and on a ship on her way to the colonies. She's on her way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to stay with Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. Because her dad is over in the colonies. Her dad is actually an explorer, and he's exploring the Ohio River Territory. So she's over there to find her dad. And she is actually heading to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, Ben Franklin isn't in Philadelphia, so she will be cared for by James, Henri, and Moses. Unfortunately, the ship she was supposed to leave England on and head to Philadelphia, she couldn't make it on that ship. Instead, the only ship she could make it on was a ship called the Dartmouth, one of the ships that was boarded by the Sons of Liberty during the Boston Tea Party. The Dartmouth is not headed for Philadelphia. The Dartmouth is unfortunately headed for Boston, and Boston is not a safe place for anyone during this time, let alone a young girl like Sarah Phillips. So you will kind of see this episode starting. Ben Franklin will be in England, in London, to see Parliament. We will see Sarah Phillips on her way, wishing she was heading to Philadelphia, but unfortunately headed to Boston. And that is where James, Henri, and Moses pop in. They need to leave Philadelphia and head to Boston to find Sarah Phillips and bring her to safety. So that is where Liberty's Kids begins. I hope you enjoy.